All right, class, we're going to pick up where we left off right here, talking about motivation. This is the motivation lecture number 2, and I'll get started by sharing my screen. And there we go. And we're going to start today with sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is our second specific motivation that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to move on to emotion today. So first, sexual behavior. Sexual motivation is something we can classify as a major motivation for people. So how does that happen? Physiologically, we know that fight or flight, the hypothalamus is the 4 F's: fight, flight, feeding, and now we get to sexual behavior. So the hypothalamus regulates sexual motivation. And what is really, really important in both men and women is the hormone testosterone. So hormones like estrogen and progesterone play far less of a role there, but the amount of testosterone does play a major role in how much you want to have sex. I want to move now to a couple of researchers by the name of Masters and Johnson. And Masters and Johnson were important researchers because they were interested in seeing what actually happened sexually. So prior to Masters and Johnson, researchers had asked people what they do sexually, but Masters and Johnson were the first one to, in the laboratory, watch people having sex. So they would put them in a room, they would have a one-way mirror, and they would record a bunch of things about them. And they also used some equipment to record, for example, erections and things like that. So they identified 4 stages of the sexual response. There was the excitement stage, plateau, orgasm, and then resolution. And what basically happened during the excitement phase is very, very similar for men and women. You got a lot of blood down to the genital area. You start to see an engorgement or erection of the penis. You also see engorgement of vaginal tissues and labia in women. And so that, at the same time, heart rate is building and blood pressure and things like that. Then generally there's a plateau stage where those things remain relatively stable. And then heart rate is going to shoot up in an orgasm stage. And an orgasm for men and women is very, very similar. It comes with muscular contractions. And then finally, afterwards, there's a resolution. And for men anyway, we say there's a refractory period in which they cannot have an orgasm again very soon after that. It'll take a little bit of time, and it'll take a lot more time as men get older. But when they're younger, they can do it a little bit sooner. So what they found in general was that the sexual response is very, very similar for both men and women. Though their organs look quite a bit different, they still respond much the same sexually. Well, Kinsey was another researcher, very important in sexual research, and he did some surveys in the 1940s and 1950s, and he found some important things, one of which I'm going to highlight here. He found that sexual behavior varied a lot, and for the first time, he found that many people engaged in what he called at the time homosexual behavior, or that many people engaged in same-sex sexual behavior. And he started to propose something that now we believe to be true, which is that homosexuality, or being being interested in same-sex partners, varies on a continuum versus opposite-sex partners. So some people are exclusively straight and some people are exclusively gay, but many people are somewhere in the middle. And he was the first person to really think that way about sexuality. Now we think about sexuality like that a lot. And I'm going to turn to some of the areas in which we have gotten rid of the binary. Binary mean 2 categories, either you're gay or you're straight. And we've said, wait a minute, there's a whole lot more in there. So this graphic, it gives you a sense of how we've kind of combated the binary. We used to think of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, sexual orientation as either you're one or the other. Now we do not think that way. So I want to go through several of these categories to kind of distinguish them from one another, because people get them mixed up. So we talked about sexual orientation at the bottom. That's who you're attracted to. Are you attracted to same-sex sexual partners, in which case it's on that homosexual end? We don't really use that term that much anymore. On the gay end, or are you on the heterosexual or the straight end there? Or you can be any point along that continuum in the middle. It's not although I have bisexual in the middle there, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are only three. You can be anywhere in there along the way. Well, then we have biological sex, and biological sex has to do with your sexual organs, your body, your parts, right? Your genetics. Are you XX or are you XY chromosomes? And there we also get a continuum, because we have many people who are intersexed, meaning, for example, that they have sexual organs that are in between male and female. And that may be caused by, for example, a lot of testosterone in an XX female during the early in utero process that makes her that would make her clitoris grow into something like a small penis. But just suffice it to say, there are a lot of medical conditions that cause a person to be in between in terms of their sexual organs. So we call that intersexed. Next, we're talking about gender expression. Now, gender expression is how you present. Are you hyper feminine, which would be like Barbie or something, or are you hyper masculine like G.I. Joe or something? So I would say with myself, I'm somewhere in between. I definitely am not, wearing lace and curling my hair and doing nails and all that crap. And yet I'm not super hyper masculine either. I'm somewhere in between, and probably most of you are in terms of gender, how you express your gender. And then finally, gender identity. Whether you consider yourself to be a woman or a man, how you define yourself, how you think about yourself. And in the middle there, sometimes we call non-binary, gender queer, and it's possible to be transgendered in the sense that your biological sex does not match your gender identity. And so maybe you were born as an XY male with a penis, but your gender identity is that of a woman. And so gender identity has nothing to do with sexual orientation. You can be either gay or straight and have and still be transgendered. So those are two separate things. Okay. I want to talk just a little for another second about sexual orientation, because there's some evidence there that's important. One of the big questions is, what causes sexual orientation? What's going on there? What causes a person to be gay or straight? And one of the things that has happened over the years is people have developed some hypotheses about what causes it. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, maybe you had some experience early in life, like you had some abuse, or maybe you grew up with just a single gender parent, a single parent, or something like that, and that's what causes it. That, it turns out, is not the case. If you look at gay men and straight men, for example, what you'll find is that many in both of these groups were abused, but there's no difference in the amount of abuse there. So that doesn't seem to cause it. And really, life experiences in general doesn't seem to cause it. What we are finding is that that the environmental evidence is mostly biological, and it mostly happens before you're born. So for example, in utero, when you're in your mother's uterus, there can be different baths of hormones present. And what we see is that different levels of hormones in utero can change the brain. Now, it doesn't mean that the person's going to come out and go, oh, I'm gay, because they haven't really discovered their sexual orientation yet, and they won't do so until puberty, but their brain is already changed. And so we've got to recognize that that there may be changes early on in life that only come out later in puberty. You don't want to assume someone's sexuality or their sexual orientation. So don't assume that somebody is male or female gender identity. Don't ask them what pronouns they want you to use, ask them what. And I think it's become much more common to talk about our pronouns now in terms of what gender we expect to be recognized as. It's also not a good idea to assume someone's sexual orientation. We used to call this concept gaydar, where we could tell if a person was gay or lesbian. And really, that just because a person presents as masculine or feminine, that, remember, is gender expression. That doesn't have anything to do with sexual orientation. So let's not make those assumptions. Let's allow people to be what they want to present as. Okay, I'm going to talk about one final thing, which is emotion. Emotions are largely universal. In different cultures, we see the same emotions: happiness, sadness, surprise, fright, disgust, contempt, anger. We can recognize those interculturally. But there are some display rules. So, for example, emotions are displayed differently depending on culture. So, for example, in Japanese culture, it's not okay to express anger in public in general. Doesn't mean people don't do it, but it's kind of like culturally inappropriate, where in other cultures, it may be more appropriate. So we have different rules, but it doesn't mean that Japanese people don't feel anger or can recognize anger in other people. So generally, emotions are pretty universal, although we have some different rules for how we display them. There are three theories of emotions that are important to know. The James Lang theory says that when we, for example, see a snake and we get afraid here, this is saying, how does that happen? What James Lang says is, you see a snake, you see the stimulus that causes the emotion, and then all of a sudden your body responds. You get this high heart rate and all of that. And that it is that bodily response that makes us feel fear. So it's actually our body responding that would make us feel fearful, not the snake itself, but it's that indirect effect through the body. The Cannon-Bard theory says that when you see the snake, your body responds, but at the same time you feel fear. But you feel fear because of the snake, not because of your body response. But these two things happen at the same time. And then finally, the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory says that there are two things going on. You see the snake, your body responds, your heart rate goes up, and your body responds in a sort of fearful way. And then you look around and you go, whoa, what's going on here? And you look at the snake and you go, oh, I must be scared of the snake. And so it is those two factors, your bodily response and your interpretation, that is causing you to feel fear. So all of those are slightly different ways of explaining why we feel fearful. What are the clues that make us feel fearful? We've got the stimulus, in this case, the snake, but then we've also got some other stuff that's going on. So in the body, when we feel an emotion like fear, our autonomic nervous system responds. For example, our heart rate changes. But this heart rate issue doesn't seem to distinguish different emotions. For example, your heart rate goes up a lot when you're angry, but it also goes up a lot when you're fearful. So the question is, how do we know what emotion we feel if your body isn't responding differently to different emotions? In your brain, your hypothalamus is going to alert you. It's going to start the autonomic nervous system or the sympathetic nervous system response. It's going to make our body, start that response of our heart rate going up, blood pressure going up, etc. The amygdala is also important, and we learned that before with regard to fear. The amygdala teaches us what to be afraid of. of. So the amygdala kind of tells us when something's a little bit eerie or scary, it responds. The hippocampus tends to be involved as well, in the sense that we are kind of conditioned to remember things that are fearful. And that's why traumatic memories sometimes are very hard to let go of. When we have too much stress and the hippocampus is activated too much, it seems to be damaging to the hippocampus itself. And we see that in post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about cognition and emotion and how thinking can change your emotions. So cognition meaning thinking. It turns out that how we interpret our emotions, that changes our emotions quite a bit. They can add to it or it can decrease it. So your thoughts about your emotions change your emotions. So for example, if a person is having a panic attack, if you interpret it as, okay, this is a panic attack. I've had this before. It's going to pass in a few minutes. I can live through this. I can wait through this. That is going to tend to reduce the bodily symptoms, and it'll tend to reduce the intensity of the emotion. If you're having a panic attack and you think, I'm having a heart attack, I'm going to die, I have to go to the hospital, I'm going to pass out, then that will tend to intensify the effect. So what we've got here is that it is the ability to therapeutically use our own interpretation to bring up or down our emotions. Okay, finally, I want to talk about expressed emotion. There is a concept of the facial feedback hypothesis. And this is the idea that when you make a particular emotional expression, like fearful, that will tend to increase your fear. Also, your body language actually can increase your emotions. So if I walk around frowning like you see some people doing, and I walk around moping around, that will tend to make me feel sadder. If I smile a lot and I'm happy and I walk with a pep in my step, that will tend to make me feel more happy. And so in fact, the way our bodies are acting and the way our face is acting actually can influence our emotions as well. And again, we call that facial feedback because your face feeds back on your emotions. All right, well, that's all I have for today, folks, and I hope you're learning to get a grasp on your own emotions through the influence of interpretation and also body and face language, because you can control your own emotions. I hope you're having a great day, and thank you for sticking in there on this lecture. Bye-bye.